The third time they towed my truck, I was standing in my kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee, staring out the window at an empty curb, and I remember thinking, these people really believe they own everything they can see. Not the houses, not the lawns, I mean the people too. The crazy part is, if they'd just left me alone, none of what happened after would have happened. I would have kept going to work, waving politely at neighbors I barely knew, paying my HOA dues like everybody else. But some people get addicted to power when their lives get too quiet, and in our neighborhood, that person was Randall Pierce. Now if you drove through Cedar Hollow Estates, you'd think it was one of those perfect little suburban pockets people move into after they get tired of city life. Clean sidewalks, matching mailboxes, those fake gas lanterns out front that everybody leaves on even though nobody actually needs them. Couples walking dogs at sunset, kids riding bikes in circles, flags hanging from porches like it was some commercial for home insurance. And for a while, honestly, I liked it there. I'd spent almost 15 years working construction management all over Arizona, bouncing from project to project, apartment to apartment, and Cedar Hollow was the first place that actually felt stable, quiet, predictable. Then my wife left. And I don't mean that dramatically. No cheating, no screaming matches, nothing like that. Rachel just got tired of living around my schedule. Too many late nights, too many weekends gone, too many years of me saying, after this project, things you'll calm down. Eventually, she packed her stuff, moved to Flagstaff with her sister, and that was that. Clean break. We still text on birthdays sometimes. Life moves on. So after the divorce, it was just me and the truck. A white Ford F-250 with faded company decals on the side and enough scratches to tell every story I'd lived through the last decade. That truck wasn't pretty, but it paid my mortgage. It carried tools, materials, ladders, paperwork, half my damn life honestly. And every night, I parked it on the street right in front of my house because my garage was packed with equipment. First few months, nobody cared. Then Randall got elected HOA president. You ever meet somebody who smiles too much when they're explaining rules to you? That was Randall. Late 60s, retired insurance guy, always wore those tucked-in polo shirts like he was headed to a golf tournament nobody invited him to. He walked around the neighborhood every morning with a clipboard. A clipboard. Like we were all inmates at some minimum security prison with landscaping requirements. At first it was little things. One neighbor got a warning because his trash cans were visible from the sidewalk. Another got fined because their Christmas lights stayed up too long. People grumbled about him, but nobody pushed back because honestly, most folks in neighborhoods like that just want peace. They'll tolerate almost anything if it keeps the illusion intact. Then Randall noticed my truck. The first warning showed up taped to my front door while I was at work. Unauthorized commercial vehicle parked overnight in community view. Community view. I actually laughed when I read that. It sounded like something written by an alien pretending to be a homeowner. I checked the HOA handbook that night. Sure enough, buried halfway down page 38, there was some vague clause about commercial vehicles being discouraged. Not banned. Discouraged. And city law clearly allowed street parking as long as the registration was current. So I ignored it. 3 days later, my truck disappeared. At first I thought it got stolen. I walked halfway down the block hitting my key fob like an idiot, listening for the horn. Nothing. Then I saw old Mrs. Delaney watering her flowers across the street, giving me that awkward look people give when they know something bad happened but don't want to get involved. She finally goes, "Honey, I think they towed it." I said, "Who's they?" And she just tilted her head toward Randall's house. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about parking anymore. It was personal. I picked my truck up from some tow yard 20 minutes outside town, paid almost $300 in cash, and the guy behind the counter barely even looked at me when he slid the receipt across the desk. You could tell this wasn't unusual for them. HOA calls, middle of the night removals, angry homeowners showing up before sunrise trying not to lose their minds. The whole thing felt weirdly routine, and honestly that made it worse. Driving home, I kept replaying one question in my head. Why me? Because there were other work trucks in Cedar Hollow. A landscaper 2 streets over had a trailer parked in his driveway half the week. Some electrician kept a company van near the community pool all the time. Nobody touched them. But Randall had decided mine was the problem. And once I started noticing it, I realized Randall had been watching me for a while. Every time I came home late from a site meeting, somehow he was outside. Every Saturday morning when I washed the truck, He'd appear at the end of the block pretending to check sprinklers or trim bushes. One time I caught him taking pictures with his phone. When he noticed me staring, he smiled and waved like we were buddies. That kind of fake politeness. Man, it'll crawl under your skin faster than somebody openly insulting you. So I went to the next HOA meeting. Now, if you've never been to one of those meetings, imagine a courtroom designed by people whose biggest life achievement is organizing recycling bins. Folding chairs, stale cookies, cheap coffee, and about 20 homeowners pretending they weren't secretly entertained by neighborhood drama. Randall sat at the front with the board members beside him, wearing this smug little expression like he was hosting a town hall debate on national television. When my turn came, I stood up calm, respectful, paperwork in hand. I said, "My truck is legally registered, insured, and parked on a public street. City ordinance allows overnight parking." Randall folded his hands and smiled. "Cedar Hollow operates under private community guidelines." I said, "Guidelines don't override city law." And that's when his expression changed. Just slightly. Tiny little twitch around the eyes. He goes, "The community has standards, Mr. Mercer." Not Daniel. Mr. Mercer. That formal tone people use when they're trying to establish dominance in front of an audience. I remember looking around the room and realizing something uncomfortable. Half the people there agreed with him. Not because they hated me. They just hated disruption. My truck reminded them somebody in the neighborhood still worked with their hands for a living. Everybody else was remote work, retired, office jobs, investment income. My truck made the place look less curated. And Randall knew it. I said, "Who owns the street?" The room went quiet. Randall answered too quickly. "The association manages community roadways." That's not what I asked. He leaned back in his chair. "You're creating conflict over a very simple issue." "No," I said. "You had my vehicle removed from public access without legal authority." One of the board members, some guy named Steve with a permanent sunburn and wraparound sunglasses sitting on his head indoors for some reason, mutters, "Maybe don't park a construction truck in a residential neighborhood." I looked at him and said, "Maybe don't touch property that isn't yours." That room got cold after that. No yelling, no dramatic scene, just silence. The kind where everybody suddenly becomes very interested in their coffee cups. Randall finally goes, "The board will review the matter," which basically meant absolutely nothing. 3 nights later, they towed my truck again. This time they took it at 2 in the morning. And this time it actually hurt me. I had a commercial roofing inspection in Tucson the next morning, a project I'd been chasing for months. By the time I realized the truck was gone, got to the tow yard, handled paperwork, and made it back, I'd already missed the meeting. Lost the contract too. 30 grand gone because some retired HOA tyrant decided he didn't like looking at my bumper. That night, something shifted in me. Up until then I kept thinking this was some misunderstanding I could solve by being reasonable. But sitting alone in my kitchen eating cold takeout at midnight, staring at another towing invoice, I finally understood something about people like Randall. They count on exhaustion. They assume eventually you'll decide fighting back costs more than surrendering. And maybe for most people, they're right. But I grew up with a father who fought unions, banks, contractors, cancer, pretty much everything life threw at him. Stubbornness was basically our family inheritance. So the next morning, I stopped arguing and started digging. I called the city transportation office first. Lady on the phone sounded confused when I gave her the street name. She goes, "Hold on. Cedar Hollow Lane isn't city maintained." I said, "What does that mean?" "It means technically it's still classified as a private development road." Now that got my attention. I spent the next 2 weeks buried in county records, zoning maps, planning documents, old development filings, stuff so boring it felt like my eyes were bleeding by midnight. But eventually the picture started coming together. Years earlier, when Cedar Hollow was first built, the original developer was supposed to transfer ownership of the roads to the city after construction finished. Totally normal process. But right around that time, the housing market crashed. The developer folded before finalizing paperwork, which meant the streets were stuck in limbo. Not public, not HOA owned either. Legally, Cedar Hollow Lane still belonged to a holding company connected to the dead development project. And here's where things got interesting. That holding company had eventually been absorbed into an infrastructure investment trust out of Nevada. One of those weird firms that buys abandoned industrial property, utility easements, forgotten land parcels, stuff nobody even realizes still exists. I almost dropped my coffee when I found the records. Because suddenly Randall's confidence made sense. He didn't actually own the street. He just assumed nobody would ever question him. That realization sat with me for a couple days. I remember driving through the neighborhood one evening, watching sprinklers hit the sidewalks while Randall walked his usual patrol route with that stupid clipboard tucked under his arm. And I had this moment where I thought, I could really mess with this guy. But honestly, at first I wasn't planning revenge. I just wanted leverage. So I contacted the investment trust. The guy who answered sounded shocked anybody even cared about the property. We went back and forth for a while, and eventually he admitted maintaining liability on unused roads was more annoying than profitable, especially one tied up in an HOA dispute. Then he asked, "You interested in buying it?" And I swear to God, the second he said those words, everything changed. Because suddenly the idea wasn't hypothetical anymore. Suddenly, there was a number. Not cheap exactly, but not impossible either. I remember sitting there in silence after the call ended, staring at my truck parked outside under the streetlight, and thinking, if I do this, there's no going back. Then I thought about the lost contract. The towing fees. Randall smiling at me across that HOA meeting table. And I made the offer. The closing paperwork took almost 2 months, and the entire time I told absolutely nobody. Not my neighbors, not coworkers, not even my brother, because I knew if this thing leaked early, Randall would start scrambling. Guys like him survive on preparation. They know every rule, every loophole, every technicality. The only way to beat somebody like that is to let them walk confidently into their own mistake. So I waited, signed documents, wired funds, sat through conference calls with lawyers who sounded genuinely amused by the whole situation. One of them actually laughed and said, "You might be the first person in American history to buy a suburban street out of spite." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. The deed arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I remember opening the envelope at my kitchen counter while an old baseball game played quietly in the background. Just a few sheets of paper, nothing dramatic, but there it was in black ink. Ownership transferred to Daniel Mercer. Cedar Hollow Lane. My street. I poured myself a bourbon that night and sat on the porch watching neighborhood lights flick on one by one. And for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. Then Saturday came. And right on schedule, they towed my truck again. I almost admired the consistency. I walked outside around 7 in the morning, saw the empty curb, and actually started laughing. Not angry laughter either. The kind that sneaks out when reality becomes too ridiculous to process normally. Mrs. Delaney across the street looked horrified. She goes, "Danny, are you all right?" I said, "Oh, I'm better than all right." I picked the truck up without saying a word, then drove straight home and typed up a certified letter addressed to Randall Pierce, HOA President, Cedar Hollow Estates. Attached to it was a copy of the deed. No threats, no insults, just one sentence highlighted in yellow. As legal owner of Cedar Hollow Lane, I do not authorize the removal of my vehicle from private property under any circumstance. That evening my phone rang while I was grilling burgers in the backyard. Randall. First time he'd ever called me directly. His voice sounded completely different now. Softer. Careful. "Daniel, I think there's been some misunderstanding." That line almost made me laugh harder than the towing did. I said, "Seems pretty straightforward to me." "Well, the roadway has always been considered community property. Community property still has an owner, Randall." Silence. You could actually hear the panic settling into him in real time. Then he goes, "What exactly is it that you want?" And that right there told me everything. Because people like Randall only ask what you want after they realize they've lost control. I said, "I wanted the towing to stop 3 months ago." For a second, I honestly thought that might be the end of it. But power makes people stupid, and Randall had spent too many years ordering people around to suddenly become reasonable. 3 days later, one of the HOA board members taped another violation notice to my door. That was when I decided we were done being civil. The next morning, I had 2 signs installed at both entrances to Cedar Hollow Lane. Private road. Authorized vehicles only. Unauthorized parking subject to towing. Underneath that, in smaller print, enforced by property owner. Then I mailed written parking authorization to every single household in the neighborhood. Every house except for Randall and the HOA board members who approved the towing. Petty? Absolutely. But after months of getting pushed around, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel incredible. And the beautiful part was, legally, there wasn't much they could do. First night, nothing happened. Second night, Steve, the sunburned HOA guy from the meeting, parked his Lexus on the street anyway like he thought I was bluffing. At 6:15 the next morning, his car was gone. You should have seen him pounding on my front door. This is harassment. I took a sip of coffee and said, "No, Steve, this is policy enforcement." The look on his face was worth every dollar I spent buying that road. By the end of the week, another board member got towed too. Then Randall's daughter came to visit and had to park 3 streets over because technically her vehicle wasn't authorized either. That one really got under his skin. Soon the entire neighborhood turned into a pressure cooker. Half the residents thought it was hilarious. The other half thought I'd become some kind of suburban supervillain. Honestly, maybe both sides were a little right. Then the lawyers got involved. The HOA hired some expensive firm out of Phoenix, probably expecting they could intimidate me into giving the road back. But once ownership records got verified, their whole argument collapsed. The city refused to interfere because legally it was private property. Even the tow company sided with me once they realized Randall had authorized removals on land he didn't own. That emergency HOA meeting was packed. People standing against walls, neighbors whispering, tension so thick you could practically smell it. Randall looked exhausted, older somehow, and for the first time since all this started. He didn't look powerful. He looked embarrassed. One homeowner stood up and asked the question everybody wanted answered. How do we fix this? The whole room turned toward me. And honestly, I'd thought about that moment for weeks. There were 100 ways I could have dragged it out longer, made their lives miserable, kept the war going just because I could. But somewhere along the line, I realized this stopped being about revenge. It was about limits. About what happens when small amounts of power go unchecked for too long. So I told them the truth. I said, reimburse every towing fee, cover the income one lost from missed work, pay the legal costs, and transfer the road to the city where it should have been years ago. Nobody argued. 30 days later, it was done. The city took ownership of Cedar Hollow Lane. New signs went up. The HOA issued formal written apologies to me and 2 other residents they'd apparently targeted before I moved in. I got every dollar back, plus more. And Randall resigned 2 weeks later. Funny thing is, I saw him once after all this ended. He was loading boxes into the trunk of his car outside the HOA office. We made eye contact for maybe 2 seconds. And you know what surprised me most? He didn't look angry. He looked confused. Like he still couldn't understand how someone he considered beneath him had beaten him at his own game. These days my truck still sits outside my house sometimes, although now nobody says a word about it. Mrs. Delaney still waves at me every morning. Kids still ride bikes through the neighborhood. Life moved on. But every once in a while, a new neighbor hears the story and asks me the same question. Was buying the street really worth it? And honestly, I still don't know. Part of me thinks the whole thing was ridiculous. 2 stubborn men turning a parking dispute into all-out suburban warfare. But another part of me thinks if nobody ever pushes back against people like Randall, they just keep going. So what do you think? Was I justified, or did I go way too far? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I guarantee this neighborhood still hasn't agreed on the answer. And if you enjoyed the story, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. Because trust me, this wasn't the first time somebody underestimated me.